September 12, 1944. The sun was already brutal by 7 in the morning. That is the first thing you need to understand about West Texas. The light does not ease you into the day. It arrives without apology, hard and white and absolute, flattening everything beneath it until the land looks less like a place and more like a fact. A geological argument that has been going on for 10,000 years and shows no sign of stopping. Lena Schreiber pressed her face close to the gap in the canvas and watched that light spread across a landscape she had no words for. She was 22 years old. She had grown up in Munich, where the streets followed patterns laid down in the medieval period, where buildings crowded together like old men sharing warmth, where the horizon was always interrupted by something. A church spire, a roofline, a hill. She had never in her life looked out at open land and been unable to find the edge of it. There was no edge here. The truck rattled down a farm road that had probably never been paved and showed no ambition to be. Dust rose in red-brown columns behind them, drifting sideways in the dry wind. Through the canvas gap she could see mesquite trees crouched low against the ground, their branches twisted into shapes that looked like they were bracing for something that had already happened. Scrub grass, caliche rock, the occasional windmill turning slowly above a metal tank, blades catching the light like signal mirrors. Nothing else. 43 women in that truck. Members of the Nachrichtenhelferin, the Wehrmacht's female auxiliary communication units. Radio operators, administrative clerks, signal coordinators, women who had processed orders, transmitted reports, maintained the bureaucratic nervous system of a military operation that now, in the autumn of 1944, was contracting back toward its origin like a dying thing pulling in its limbs. They had been captured during the Allied advance through France, processed at 2 different collection points, shipped across the Atlantic on a vessel that smelled of diesel and institutional disinfectant, spent 3 weeks in a processing facility at Fort Bliss, outside El Paso, where the paperwork of their captivity was formalized, their photographs taken, their particulars recorded in triplicate. According to Record Group 389 at the National Archives, they were one of 7 female prisoner-of-war contingents held on American soil during the Second World War. Total number of German women in American custody between 1944 and 1945, 287. They were, in every administrative sense, an anomaly. Too small a number to matter strategically, too specific a situation to fit neatly into existing protocols. What the paperwork did not capture was what it felt like to be one of them. Lena pulled back from the gap and pressed her spine against the metal frame of the truck. Beside her, Marta Vogel sat with both hands folded in her lap, fingers laced together so tightly the knuckles had gone white. Marta was 19 years old. She had been born in Dresden and had never been farther from home than Leipzig before the war changed all the calculations of her life. She had been trembling since they boarded the ship at Cherbourg 23 days ago. Not the violent trembling of cold or fever. Something smaller and more constant. A vibration that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her and could not be reasoned with or willed away. In her hands she held a photograph. Black and white, slightly creased along one corner. Her family, taken in the summer of 1941, before her father was conscripted, before the bombing changed the shape of Dresden's skyline. She had carried it through capture and processing and the Atlantic crossing and 3 weeks in a holding facility, and she was carrying it now, and she would keep carrying it into whatever came next. Across from them, Ida Krantz occupied her space the way certain people occupy spaces, completely without apparent awareness that anyone else might need some of it. She was 31 years old, a former surgical nursing assistant who had served at a field hospital on the Eastern Front before being transferred to administrative duties in France. She was unpacking and repacking her small kit bag with methodical precision, checking each item against some internal list, her face arranged in an expression of focused neutrality that Lena had come to recognize over the past 3 weeks as something more complicated than calm. Ida did not talk about Hamburg. No one had asked her to explain this, and she had not volunteered it. But there was a quality to her silence on the subject that had its own weight, its own specific gravity, and the other women had learned to navigate around it without comment. The truck slowed. Lena moved back to the canvas gap. What she saw first was the fence. Split rail, weathered silver gray, running in long straight lines across the land in both directions as far as she could see. Not wire and posts with the functional brutality of military enclosure. This fence looked like it had been standing for decades, like it was part of the landscape rather than imposed upon it, like the land itself had decided where the boundary should be and the fence had simply agreed. Beyond the fence, horses. 4 of them, moving slowly through dry grass beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees whose leaves had gone yellow at the edges. Their bodies caught the morning light in a way that made them look painted rather than real. Copper and black and gray, muscles moving beneath their coats like something breathing under a thin blanket. Then the ranch house came into view. 2 stories, wood frame, white paint weathered to the color of old bone. A porch running the full length of the front. A barn behind it, larger than it had any right to be, its red paint faded to something between rust and pink. Corrals made of the same split-rail fencing. Water troughs, a windmill, a bunkhouse set back from the main structure at a respectful distance. And men. 3 of them, near the largest corral, moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who have been doing the same work for long enough that the work has become part of how they exist in the world. Wide-brimmed hats, boots, shirts with the sleeves rolled to the elbow. They moved the way certain animals move. Not slowly, exactly, but with a completeness of presence that made speed seem unnecessary. The truck rolled through the gate and stopped. A beat of complete silence. The engine ticked as it cooled. Wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water. Then the canvas at the back of the truck folded down, and the light came in all at once. Lieutenant Dorothy Hale stood at the rear of the truck. 34 years old, Army officer, her uniform pressed to a standard that seemed to require considerable effort in the Texas heat. Her face was the face of someone who has decided, at some point, that professionalism is not just a standard but a form of protection. For herself and, perhaps, for everyone around her. Private Kessler stood beside her. 24 years old, a former university student who had studied German literature and was now applying those skills in ways his professors had not anticipated. The women climbed down, legs stiff from days of travel, eyes adjusting to the brightness. 43 women standing in the dust of a Texas ranch yard, their gray auxiliary uniforms marked with the wear of a journey that had carried them across an ocean and into a landscape that bore no relationship to anything they had known. Lena stood and looked around. To her left, the barracks the army had erected. Wooden frames, canvas roofs, arranged in 2 rows with military regularity. To her right, the barn, the corrals, the horses, and near the corral fence, the men. One of them was standing slightly apart from the others. He was leaning against the top rail with his forearms resting on the wood, hat pushed back slightly on his head, watching the new arrivals with an expression that Lena could not immediately classify. She was good at reading faces. She had learned to be, in the years since the war had made careful observation a survival skill. But this face did not fit any category she had developed. He was enormous, 6 feet 4 inches, perhaps more. Broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke not of deliberate exercise but of a life's worth of physical work. His hands, visible where they rested on the fence rail, were the hands of someone who had been using them hard since adolescence. Scarred, calloused, the knuckles enlarged from years of labor. His face was weathered by sun and wind to the color and texture of good leather, the lines in it not signs of age so much as evidence of decades spent squinting into a Texas sky. He was watching them, not with hostility, not with welcome, with the careful attention of someone who takes the measure of things seriously and does not rush the process. Lieutenant Hale organized the logistics of disembarkation. The women clustered together in the automatic way of people who are uncertain and are finding their orientation through proximity to each other. Then the large man pushed off from the fence. He walked toward the group with the gait of someone who has covered a great deal of ground on foot and horseback and has arrived at a relationship with physical movement that requires no thought. He stopped several feet from Lieutenant Hale, removed his hat, revealing hair the color of old hay, and held it against his chest. Then he looked at the 43 women standing in the dust of his yard, and he bowed his head, not the abbreviated nod of acknowledgement, not the brisk inclination of professional courtesy. He bowed his head the way someone bows their head before a meal, or at the end of a long day, or at a grave, with a quality of genuine attention that converted the gesture from social form into something that meant exactly what it appeared to mean. Lena felt something shift in her chest. In 4 years of service with the Wehrmacht, she had stood before officers of various ranks and dispositions. She had received orders, processed communications, followed protocols. Not once in 4 years had anyone in a position of authority bowed their head in her direction. Not once had anyone communicated, through the language of the body, anything that resembled this. Lieutenant Hale introduced him, Caleb Rourke, owner and foreman of the Rourke Ranch. He would be overseeing the work assignments for those women assigned to ranch operations.
Kessler translated.
Rourke put his hat back on and touched the brim, a gesture Lena would come to recognize as his standard unit of acknowledgement. The economy of a man who had reduced his communication to its essential elements. He walked back toward his crew. The 2 men with him, Walt Garrison, 52 years old, lean and durable, with the kind of face shaped by weather rather than time, his temples gone silver, and Jesse Aldridge, 30, quiet in the way of someone who has evaluated the available options and determined that silence is usually the more accurate response. Lena watched all 3 of them go. Beside her, Marta was still holding the photograph. The barracks were simple and clean. Metal cots with thin mattresses, gray wool blankets, small foot lockers at the end of each bed. The canvas roofs were new enough that they did not leak. Lena chose a cot near a window. Marta took the one beside her. Across the narrow aisle, Ida unpacked her kit bag with the same methodical precision she had used on the truck, placing each item in the foot locker with the care of someone arranging an operating theater. Marta said, barely above a whisper, "Did you see the size of them? Cowboys," Ida said, without looking up from her unpacking. "They work cattle and horses. They live outdoors. The physical work makes them strong." A brief pause. "I read about them once." Through the window, Lena could see the main yard and, beyond it, the corrals. Walt Garrison was leading a horse toward the barn. The animal was enormous, taller than any horse Lena had seen in Germany. Its coat a deep copper red that caught the sun like a coal catching a draft. "None of this," Lena said slowly, "is what we were told to expect." Neither of the other women answered, because there was nothing to add to that. The orientation took place that afternoon in the main ranch dining hall. A large room with exposed wooden beams and windows that framed the Texas sky in rectangles of such pure blue they looked like paintings inserted into the wall. Long tables, long benches, the smell of coffee and old wood. Lieutenant Hale outlined their situation. 6 days of work per week, tasks assigned by category, treatment according to the standards of the Geneva Convention. According to Field Manual 19-40, Article 25 through 32, female prisoners of war were to be provided with adequate nutrition equivalent to American service personnel of equivalent rank. Lieutenant Hale would inspect food rations weekly. The baseline was 2,800 calories per day. Then the door opened. Rourke, Garrison, and Aldridge came in from outside, removing their hats as they crossed the threshold. Rourke stepped forward. He looked at the assembled women for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low and unhurried, carrying the quality of a man who has learned that if you speak quietly and mean what you say, people will find a way to hear you. "I know you can't understand much of what I'm saying, but I want you to know something. This is a working ranch. We have cattle to move, horses to care for, fences to mend. It's hard work and honest work. I don't care where you're from or what uniform you wore. While you're here, you'll be treated with respect. I expect the same in return." Kessler translated, stumbling slightly over the idiom. Silence in the room. Marta leaned toward Lena and said very quietly, "He is nothing like what we were told Americans would be." Lena nodded once. Nothing about this place matched what she had been taught to expect. And she was experienced enough by now to understand that when reality diverges sharply from expectation, the appropriate response is always the same. Pay attention. Revise. The first work assignment began before sunrise the following morning. Walt Garrison met Lena's group at the main barn as the eastern sky was beginning to separate from the darkness above it. A thin line of gray gold along the horizon that would take another 20 minutes to become something you could call light. He held a bucket of grain in one hand and a lead rope in the other, and he moved into the barn with the easy assumption that they would follow him. They did. The barn swallowed the thin morning light and replaced it with the warmer darkness of hay, dust, and old wood. The accumulated warmth of large animals breathing in enclosed space. Horses occupied stalls on both sides of the central aisle, their heads appearing over the half-doors as the group passed. At the far end of the left row, a gray mare stood with her head turned slightly away from the door. "That's Flint," Garrison said. He said it the way you introduce someone you want to be understood correctly. "She's been here 3 years. Previous owner wasn't good to her. She doesn't trust easy." He demonstrated the procedure for measuring grain and filling the hay net. His movements were efficient and slow at the same time. The economy of someone who has performed this action thousands of times and has long since eliminated everything unnecessary. He handed the grain bucket to the woman nearest him. She approached Flint's stall with appropriate caution. The mare shifted away from the door, pressed her hindquarters into the far corner, ears moving with the tight attention of an animal monitoring a potential threat. Then Lena stepped forward. She did not do it deliberately. There was no calculation in it. She simply moved toward the stall because the mare's posture communicated something she recognized. The language of a creature that has learned that the approach of others almost always means something is about to be taken or imposed. And something in Lena responded to that language without passing through the filter of rational decision. She stopped at the stall door and stood still. She did not reach for the latch. She did not make a sound. She simply stood with her hands loose at her sides and let the horse come to whatever conclusion the horse was going to come to at whatever speed the horse required. Flint's ears moved forward. The mare turned her head, slowly, until she was looking at Lena directly. A long moment of assessment, dark eyes moving over this new presence with the careful intelligence of an animal that has learned not to make quick determinations. Then, by degrees, the tension left her posture. The hindquarters settled. The ears came fully forward. The mare walked to the door and put her nose into Lena's palm. Garrison was quiet for a moment. "She doesn't do that," he said. Not an exclamation, an observation. This horse was mistreated by her previous owner. She only trusts people who come to her without the intention of controlling her. She knows the difference. He paused. "She always knows the difference." "My apologies," he said. His voice carried no apology at all. Marta sat very still. She was still holding her photograph in her left hand. She had not put it down to eat. She looked at the tray on the floor and then looked at nothing in particular. Across the room, Rourke stood up. He said nothing to Hatch. He walked to where the tray had fallen, bent down, picked it up, carried it to the serving area and came back with a full tray. He set it on the table in front of Marta. He did not look at Hatch while he did this. He looked at the tray, set it down level and walked back to his table. He picked up his fork and continued eating. Lena watched the economy of it. The action that communicated exactly what it needed to communicate without requiring any words, without producing any confrontation, without creating a situation that demanded response from anyone else. The action of a man who has determined what is correct and simply does it. At some point during the meal, she became aware that Rourke was looking in her direction. Not a stare, just a look, brief, direct, the nod that followed barely perceptible. The same small acknowledgement he had given her that afternoon at the corral. She looked back. "The way you begin." That night in the barracks, after the lights had been turned down, Lena opened her journal. Small, leather-bound, dark brown. She had carried it through her entire service. She wrote for a long time. She wrote about the landscape, about the quality of the Texas light, about Flint, about the specific vocabulary of an animal that has learned not to make quick determinations, about the dining hall and the tray on the floor and the man who had picked it up without comment and without drama and without requiring anything in return. She wrote. The largest man in the room did not need to raise his voice. Then she closed the journal and lay on her back in the darkness. Through the window above her cot, The Texas sky was enormous and absolutely clear, the stars dense enough to look structural rather than decorative. Not scattered lights, but a kind of architecture. Something load-bearing. Something that had been there so long it had become part of what held the darkness up. She had been certain, on that truck, that she was coming to a place where she would be reduced to her category. Prisoner. Enemy. Artifact of a war moving toward its conclusion. She was not certain of that anymore. It was not enough. Not yet. But it was something. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwood trees with the sound of water that was not there, and the horses moved in the darkness of the corrals, and the stars continued their long structural work above the sleeping ranch. September 12, 1944. The first day. October arrived the way change usually arrives in the lives of people who are waiting for something. Not announced, not dramatic, but present one morning in the quality of the light and the temperature of the air and the particular way the cottonwood leaves moved against the sky. The heat broke in the first week of the month. The nights became cold enough to require the gray wool blankets in earnest. The days were still bright, still clear, but the sun had changed its angle, and the shadows it produced were longer and more deliberate. The women had been at the Rourke Ranch for 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, a person can learn the geography of a small space with a completeness that comes from having no alternative. Every path between barracks and dining hall and work assignment memorized not deliberately but through repetition, through the accumulated evidence of boots on the same ground at the same time each day until the route becomes part of the body rather than the mind. Lena had navigated carefully. She had been assigned to ranch operations, the group that worked directly with Rourke and his crew. 6 women, learning the vocabulary of a working cattle ranch through demonstration and observation and the particular kind of comprehension that does not require language. Walt Garrison was a patient teacher, not in the deliberate pedagogical sense. He simply did what needed doing and allowed the watching of it to accomplish what explanation could not. He moved through his work at a pace that was exactly correct for the task, and if you paid attention, you could extract the principle from the practice and apply it. Flint had accepted Lena completely by the 2nd week. Garrison had told her, in his careful economy of words, that the gray mare had been at the ranch for 3 years and had allowed perhaps 4 people close enough to be considered genuinely trusted. The horse's previous owner had been the kind of man who mistakes fear for respect, and the damage done by that misunderstanding had settled into Flint's nervous system as a permanent alteration. A hair-trigger wariness that most people encountered as hostility but was, in fact, just the opposite. The desperate vigilance of a creature that has decided it cannot afford to be wrong again. Lena understood this in a way she did not try to articulate. She spent time with Flint each morning before the formal work began. Standing at the stall door, talking quietly in German that the horse obviously could not understand but seemed to find acceptable as sound, as evidence of a voice that was not going to rise or sharpen. Over 2 weeks, the mare had progressed from cautious tolerance to something that looked like genuine preference. She would turn toward the door when she heard Lena's step in the aisle. She would bring her head forward to meet a hand that had not even been extended yet. Jesse Aldridge watched this one morning from across the barn. "She waits for you," he said. "I've been here 2 years, and she's never done that for me." Lena considered how to respond in a language she was only beginning to reconstruct. "She knows," she said finally. "What does she know?" Lena looked at the mare. "That I am also learning to be here." Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once and went back to work. This was the texture of those early weeks. Small exchanges, partial communications that carried more than their literal content. The slow accumulation of a working relationship built not from decisions made in the abstract but from the concrete and daily proximity of shared labor. In the 3rd week of September, Rourke organized a cattle drive. Short by ranch standards, moving 200 head from the north pasture to the southern grazing ground. Lena volunteered without fully understanding what she was volunteering for. The instinct of someone who has always preferred motion to waiting, even when the motion leads somewhere unknown. She rode at the edge of the group, watching Rourke and his crew work with a synchronicity that needed no verbal coordination. A slight nod from Rourke sent Aldridge circling left. A low sound from Garrison brought a straying animal back into line. Their horses responded to the smallest pressure of knee or heel, as though rider and animal had arrived at a shared understanding that predated language. It was unlike any precision she had known. Military precision was imposed. Designed, drilled, maintained through the threat of consequence. This was something older. Something arrived at through long negotiation between people and animals and land, held together not because anyone was enforcing it but because it worked. When the cattle were settled, Rourke rode back along the fence line. He stopped near where Lena sat, pulled a canteen from his saddle, and drank. He nodded once in return, touched the hat brim, and passed the canteen along to Marta, who stood nearby, without altering his expression or his pace. Lena watched him ride away. It was such a small thing. The extension of a canteen. The assumption that thirst was thirst regardless of which side of a war you had been on. She could not have explained why it landed with the weight it did. Why this particular gesture, in this particular moment, felt like the first thing in months that had been offered to her simply because she was a person who was present and might need it. She filed it away in the part of her mind where she kept things that required more time than she currently had to understand them fully. The mail arrived on a Tuesday in the second week of October. Lieutenant Hale distributed it in the barracks after the evening meal, working from a clipboard, calling names in the careful pronunciation of someone who has learned a foreign language's phonetics without its music. Some women received multiple envelopes. Some received one. Some received nothing. The letters had been censored. Thin black lines through entire sentences, sometimes entire paragraphs. But they were connections. Evidence that somewhere across the Atlantic, in the landscape of a war moving toward some kind of resolution that was still too distant to see clearly, people were still alive and writing. Marta received two. She took them to her cot and sat with her back to the room, holding them for a long time before opening either. In the yard outside, in the clear cold of the October night, Ida sat alone on the wooden step outside the barracks door. She was looking up at the sky with the particular quality of attention you give to something you are looking at instead of something else. Over the next hour, Lena practiced. The other women gathered to watch and then, gradually, to request their own attempts. Garrison produced additional ropes, and soon the yard held half a dozen German women engaged in the focused, slightly absurd pursuit of a skill that had no obvious application to any life they had previously imagined for themselves. Jesse Aldridge rode up on his bay gelding and stopped at the edge of the yard. "You're going to make cowgirls out of them," he called to Garrison. "Might do worse," Garrison replied, without looking up. "They work harder than most of the ranch hands I've seen come through here." It was a casual observation, offered without ceremony, without the self-consciousness of someone making a deliberate point. The assessment of a man who has watched a thing long enough to have an honest opinion of it and sees no reason not to share that opinion. Lena heard it. She registered it the way you register a thing you did not know you needed until you were given it. Not the manufactured pride of service to a collective abstraction. Something simpler and more personal. The satisfaction of learning a new skill, of being recognized for honest effort by someone who had no obligation to recognize it. She threw the rope again. It opened into a clean loop and settled over the fence post 6 feet away. Not perfectly, but recognizably. Garrison looked at it, nodded once. "There you go," he said. The fire that evening was Rourke's idea. He appeared at the edge of the yard after the day's work, carrying an armful of wood. He built the fire in the stone ring behind the barn, a structure that had clearly been used for this purpose many times. The stones blackened and settled into the ground with the permanence of something that has earned its place through use. He looked at the 6 women who had gathered at the edge of the yard. "Coffee's on," he said, a battered pot on a metal grate over the fire, steam beginning to rise from its spout. He gestured toward the logs arranged in a semicircle around the fire pit. An invitation with no obligation attached to it. Simply a description of a possibility, leaving the response entirely to the people being invited. Lena looked back toward the barracks. Lieutenant Hale's office window was lit. The lieutenant was at her desk, visible in the lamplight. She was not looking out. She was not intervening. The women sat. For a time, no one spoke. The fire moved in the cold air, and the coffee heated, and the darkness gathered in from the edges of the yard with the patience it always demonstrates. They sat in it together. 6 German women and 1 Texas rancher occupying the same space on the same November evening without any of the frameworks that the larger world used to define their relationship to each other being particularly present or relevant. Rourke poured the coffee into tin cups and handed them around. He did it with the matter-of-fact generosity he seemed to apply to most things. Not the self-consciousness of someone performing generosity. The simple action of a man who has coffee and sees people who could use some. Walt Garrison and Jesse Aldridge came around the corner of the barn and settled onto the remaining logs without comment, as though this was a thing that happened regularly and they had simply arrived at their usual time. Rourke and Garrison began talking about the following day's work. Their conversation moved at the pace that conversations between people who know each other very well move. Slowly, with long pauses between statements, with the comfortable assumption that the other person would still be there when the thought was ready to continue. Lena found this quality of silence remarkable. The military life she had known was organized around sound. Orders, responses, the machinery of command and compliance. These men inhabited silence the way they inhabited the rest of their available space. Completely, without apparent discomfort, as though it were simply another form of communication that happened to involve no words. Marta pointed up at the sky, where the November darkness had produced a display of stars that was, by any objective measure, extraordinary. Very beautiful, she said. 2 words in a language she was still learning to inhabit. Rourke followed her gesture to the sky. He looked at it for a moment with the unhurried attention of a man who has looked at this exact sky thousands of times and has not yet exhausted what he finds there. Never gets old, he said. No matter how many times you see it. Garrison offered a version in halting German that was close enough to communicate the essential content, and the women nodded in the way people nod when they have understood something that was not entirely transmitted through language. Lena looked at the sky. She thought about Munich, about city light at night, which was never dark in the way this was dark, which was never quiet in the way this was quiet, about what it would mean if those streets, those buildings, that light had been altered past recognition. She did not pursue the thought to its conclusion. She drank her coffee and watched the fire and allowed the November evening to be what it was without requiring it to mean anything beyond itself. They sat there until the cold became definitive. Then, gradually, by ones and twos, they moved back toward the barracks. Lena was the last to rise. Rourke was banking the fire with a long iron rod, with the careful attention of someone ensuring that a thing ends properly. She stood for a moment watching him. He looked up. The brief nod. The touch of the hat brim. She walked back to the barracks and wrote for a long time in her journal. December. The cold arrived with the month and brought with it a quality of light different from anything the earlier weeks had produced. Thinner, more horizontal, falling across the land at angles that made the ranch look, in certain hours, like a painting of itself. Lieutenant Hale called a full assembly in the dining hall on the 2nd Tuesday of the month. The women gathered in the familiar room. American soldiers lined the walls. Private Kessler stood at the front beside the lieutenant, his face carrying the expression of someone who has been briefed on what he will be asked to translate and is managing his response to that information. On the table beside Lieutenant Hale, a stack of papers, several photographs, face down. "I'm going to show you something," she said, and waited for Kessler. "This isn't easy, but you need to see it. You need to understand what has been discovered as the Allied forces advanced." She turned the first photograph over and passed it into the group. The room received it in a silence that was different from the silences that had preceded it. Not the silence of people waiting for something, but the silence of people encountering something for which their previous experience has not prepared them. Dachau.
Bergen-Belsen.
Auschwitz. The photographs moved through the room slowly, each woman taking her allotted time with them, each response different and each response, in its own way, the same. Some looked and looked away immediately. Some could not look away. Some closed their eyes. According to the report of Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb of the 7th Army, dated May 3, 1945, Dachau concentration camp held 32,335 living prisoners at the time of its liberation. The estimated number of dead within the camp's operational period was 41,500. In the dining hall of the Rourke Ranch on a December evening in 1944, they were not statistics yet. They were photographs. Lena held one for a long time. It showed a building, and outside the building, a pile of documents, administrative files, records, the paper architecture of a bureaucratic operation that had been partially burned and then interrupted before the burning was complete. Pages curling at the edges, some legible, some not. She looked at the image and her mind moved, without her permission, to a specific memory. A morning in June of 1943. A desk in a processing office outside Lyon. A list of names. She had not known whose names, had not been told whose names, had been given the document and told to transmit it via the radio equipment she operated with the clean competence she had always brought to her work. The heading on the document had read, Sondertransport, Special Transport. She had transmitted the list. She had logged the transmission. She had moved on to the next task. She looked at the photograph of the burned documents and understood, with a completeness that did not permit negotiation or qualification, what Sondertransport had meant. She had not known. She was certain of this. Not as a defense, but as a fact. She had not known. She had processed a document through a system whose function she had not understood and whose ultimate purpose had been kept from her by the architecture of a bureaucracy designed to distribute both labor and knowledge in ways that prevented exactly this kind of comprehension. She had not known. And the not knowing changed nothing about what the knowing now cost. Lieutenant Hale spoke for a long time. She spoke about what had been found, about what the evidence demonstrated, about the scale of what had occurred. She spoke about the women in this room and about what serving this system meant and did not mean in terms of responsibility. She spoke with the precision of someone who has thought carefully about what needs to be said and has decided that clarity, even when it is painful, is a form of respect. When she finished, the room was quiet for a long time. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the assembled women, a voice said, in German, "We didn't know." And then, after a pause, "We didn't know." Lieutenant Hale looked at the room. Her expression had changed from its professional neutrality into something more complicated. Not softened, exactly, but expanded, as though it had made room for something it had not previously been required to contain. "Many Germans did not know," she said, her voice quieter than it had been. "But not knowing does not erase what happened. You are going to have to decide what you do with this knowledge." She left the photographs on the table and walked out. The room did not move for a long time. Lena sat with the image of the burned documents and the memory of a specific morning in June of 1943, and did not attempt to resolve the relationship between them into something manageable or clean. She held both things at the same time and allowed them to occupy the space they required, which was more than she had available, which meant that something was going to have to give way to make room. That night, the barracks were quiet except for the sounds that people make when they are in the presence of something too large for sleep. Lena lay on her back and looked at the ceiling. Through the window, across the dark yard, the light in Rourke's office was on. He was at his desk, in the warm rectangle of lamplight. She watched the light for a long time. She thought about the question she could not answer. Whether redemption was a thing that could be sought by a person who had served a system capable of what those photographs had shown, even unknowingly, even at the furthest remove from the decisions that had made them possible. Whether you could choose to become something else, once you knew what you had been adjacent to. Whether it mattered that you had not known. She did not have answers. She had only the questions, and the light across the yard, and the knowledge that in the morning the work would begin again. She closed her eyes. Outside, the December cold settled over the ranch with the impartial thoroughness it applies to everything. The barn and the corrals and the split-rail fences and the horses standing in their stalls and the land going on in every direction beyond the reach of any light. The stars continued their long work. The 3 days that followed the assembly were the quietest the ranch had known. Not the quiet of peace, the quiet of aftermath. The specific silence that settles over a place where something has been said that cannot be unsaid, where a door has been opened onto a room whose contents have permanently altered the dimensions of everything outside it. The women moved through their work with the mechanical competence of people whose bodies have memorized the tasks well enough to perform them without full participation of the mind. They fed the horses. They mended fence lines. They carried water and moved feed and did what the morning required. But they were elsewhere. Lena was aware of this in herself as a physical phenomenon. The sensation of being present in a body that was functioning correctly while the part of her that organized meaning and consequence was operating in a different location entirely, circling the same territory without finding a way through it. She had always been someone who processed difficulty through action. This was not that kind of difficulty. It had no available solution. It had only a reckoning which was different from a solution in every way that mattered. On the third morning, she was sitting on the fence rail outside the main corral before the work call, her food untouched beside her. The January air was cold enough to produce breath in small clouds. The pasture beyond the fence was white with frost. She heard footsteps on the hard ground. Rourke stopped several feet to her left, leaning his forearms on the top rail. He looked out at the frosted pasture for a long moment. The horses were moving slowly at the far end, their breath visible in the cold air. He did not look at her immediately. He looked at the horses. When he spoke, his voice was low and without preamble. "My grandfather fought in the First War," he said. "Came back different. Took him years before he could talk about any of it." He paused, watching the horses. "He told me once that the hardest thing wasn't what he'd done or seen himself. It was learning what his own side had done when he wasn't looking. Things that made him question everything he'd believed about who the good men were." Lena's English had improved enough over the months to follow most of this without Kessler. She followed it now, and she followed what was underneath it, the care with which it was being offered, the precision of its application to the specific weight of the morning. "I typed a list," she said. "In 1943. I did not know what it was." She stopped, considered the words available to her. "I know now." Rourke was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "not a dismissal, an acknowledgement, the word of a man who understands that some things require to be witnessed rather than resolved." He turned slightly toward her. "I've watched you work these months, watched you with Flint, watched you help the younger ones when they're struggling, watched you do every task we've given you with honesty and effort." He paused. "That's not nothing. It does not undo." "No," he said, "it doesn't. Nothing undoes anything." He looked at the horses again. "But what you do going forward is what shows who you actually are. Not where you came from, not what flag you served. What you choose to do now." He pushed off the fence rail. "Actions," he said simply. "That's the only measure that holds up over time." He walked back toward the barn. Lena sat on the fence rail and turned that word over in her mind. Actions. She picked up her food and ate it. 3 days after that conversation, Marta came to find her. It was late afternoon, the winter light already pulling back from the western edge of the sky. Marta sat on the same fence rail and looked at her hands for a long moment before she spoke. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I have not told anyone. Not since it happened." Lena waited. "In August, before I was captured." Marta kept her eyes on her hands. They were not trembling. They had not trembled since October, since the letters. But they were very still in the particular way of hands being held deliberately. "I was working the morning transmission. Priority signal came through. Movement orders, time-sensitive. I was alone in the office for 12 minutes. She paused. "I held it for 6 hours before I sent it." Lena looked at her. 6 hours, Marta said. "I told myself the equipment had malfunctioned. I wrote it in the log that way. I do not know what those 6 hours changed, whether they mattered at all in any measurable sense." Another pause. "It probably did not matter. The war was what it was. But I chose. I want you to know that I chose. That I was not entirely without a choice." The cold air moved between them. Lena thought about the list she had transmitted in Lion, about the difference between those two actions. Hers, performed in complete ignorance of its meaning. Marta's, performed in the partial, terrified knowledge of someone who understood enough to hesitate but not enough to do more than hesitate. About the territory between knowing and not knowing, where most of the actual living of a life under those circumstances had taken place. "You kept this for 14 months, Lena said. I am telling you now, Marta said, because you are the only person I know who will understand what it costs to carry it, and because I think we have both been carrying things that were too heavy to carry alone. And I would like to put some of it down. Lena sat beside her on the fence rail. They stayed there until the light was gone. January arrived with violence. The storm came without adequate warning on a Thursday afternoon. The sky changed from its usual hard blue to a flat, yellowish gray within the space of an hour. The temperature dropped 20 degrees before sunset. The wind arrived from the north with a force that made the canvas roofs of the barracks flex and strain like living things trying to escape their constraints. By 8 o'clock that evening, it was a blizzard. Rourke had spent the afternoon making preparations with the methodical urgency of a man who has lived through West Texas winters long enough to understand their arithmetic. But the storm exceeded the calculations. Jesse Aldridge came in from a perimeter check with ice on his hat brim and news that a section of the fence in the north pasture had come down, and 30 head of cattle had moved through it into the exposed eastern range. Rourke went to Lieutenant Hale directly. Their conversation was brief. I need everyone available, he said. The cattle won't survive the night out there. Hale looked at him for a moment. Then, you have them. The departure into the storm was a shock that was primarily physical. The cold arriving against exposed skin with the particular aggression of weather that has moved past discomfort into something more serious. The wind making upright movement a negotiation rather than an assumption. Lena mounted one of the working horses and followed Rourke into the white. Visibility dropped within the first 100 yards to the length of a horse's body. The landscape she had spent months learning became illegible under the blizzard's erasure. She rode close to the horse in front of her, trusting the animal's instincts over her own orientation. She was riding beside Ida Krantz. Ida rode with the same focused competence she brought to everything. No wasted movement, no visible response to the cold beyond the purely functional. Her attention organized entirely around the task. They found the cattle in a shallow ravine at the eastern edge of the property. 31 animals pressed together against the low bank, their bodies generating what collective warmth they could, their distress audible even over the wind. The work of moving them began. Cattle in a state of cold-driven distress are not cooperative. They resist in the way of animals that have been frightened past the point where instruction is accessible. You have to be patient and persistent and present at every angle simultaneously, sealing off the wrong directions, maintaining pressure at the correct ones, communicating through your horse's body a message that the animals can feel if not understand. They had been working for perhaps 40 minutes when Ida's horse went down. The gelding's front left leg found a concealed drainage ditch beneath the snow, and the animal stumbled with a force that pitched Ida sideways and deposited her into a snowbank before anyone could react. Lena saw it happen and pulled up hard. Across the small distance between them, Vernon Hatch also saw it happen. He was closer. He stopped. 1 second. 2. Lena watched him in that pause. Watched what moved across his face in the space of those 2 seconds. The internal negotiation between the thing he had been carrying for months and the thing that the moment was demanding of him. The arithmetic of a man who has organized his responses around a particular story about who these people were, confronting the immediate and undeniable reality of a woman in the snow in a blizzard. He made his decision and moved. He reached Ida in 5 strides, reaching down to grip her arm and pull her upright with a force that was more urgent than delicate but entirely effective. She came up out of the snow gasping, checking herself automatically with the quick efficiency of a medical professional assessing for damage. In the act of stabilizing her, Hatch's grip shifted to her coat collar, pulling it straight. And there, on the collar, visible for a moment before Ida resettled her scarf, was the nursing insignia she had worn throughout her service. The same design, the same dimensions, as the insignia his younger brother had worn in the photograph that Hatch carried in his wallet. The photograph he had looked at every day since Normandy. The one that represented the specific weight of a loss he had been translating into hostility for months because hostility was something he knew how to carry and grief was not. His hands went still for a moment. Then he finished pulling her collar straight, confirmed her footing, and turned back to the work without a word. Lena had watched all of this from 6 feet away. She said nothing either. She turned her horse back toward the cattle and continued working. It took 3 hours to drive the animals to the safety of the barn. By the time the doors closed behind the last of them, everyone was frost-touched and exhausted in the specific way that comes from sustained physical effort in conditions that are actively working against you. In the barn's warmth, they moved through the aftermath together, drying down the animals, checking for frostbite, distributing hay and breaking ice in the water troughs. The work organized itself without instruction, each person moving to where the need was visible and doing what the need required. Nationality had ceased to function as a relevant category. There was only the shared purpose of preserving life against a hostile environment. Lena was working at the far end of the cattle line when she felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Rourke stood behind her, his hat still carrying remnant ice from the search. He looked at her with the direct, assessing attention he applied to things he was taking seriously. "Good work out there," he said. "Couldn't have done it without you," simply said. No ceremony, no performance. The straightforward assessment of a man reporting an accurate observation. But it landed with a weight disproportionate to the words themselves. Because it was the first time he had spoken to her not as someone under his supervision, not as a prisoner to whom kindness was being extended, but as a person whose participation in a shared task had been necessary and was being recognized as such. She had not been visible in that way in a very long time. She nodded, turned back to the cattle, did not speak again until the work was done. In the days that followed the blizzard, something shifted in the texture of the ranch's daily life. Vernon Hatch did not transform overnight. He was not a man who expressed things in sudden declarations or dramatic reversals. He was a man whose character expressed itself in exactly the way Rourke's did. Through the accumulation of small, consistent choices made in the direction of a thing he had decided, at some point in the storm and its aftermath, that he was choosing. He stopped going out of his way to make the German women's presence difficult. He stopped producing the particular quality of looking through someone that communicates contempt more completely than any verbal statement. On the third morning after the storm, he held the barn door open for Marta, who was carrying a bucket in each hand. He did not acknowledge having done this. He walked in ahead of her and went about his work. It was not forgiveness on either side. It was something more practical and more durable than forgiveness. The decision, made independently by two people in the same general direction, to act according to a principle that made the next thing possible. Lena observed all of this without comment. She was learning, in these months, that the most significant things that happen between people often happen quietly, without announcement, in the texture of ordinary interactions rather than in the moments designed to carry meaning. The design of meaning was mostly retrospective, she was beginning to understand. In the actual living of it, significance arrived in the same packaging as everything else. The letter from the War Department had arrived in Rourke's office in the second week of January, in the days following the blizzard. He did not mention it until late February, when the outlines of what was coming were legible enough in the radio reports that the women had begun, quietly, to speak among themselves about what came after. Lena was in the barn with Flint when he came to find her. The mare was restless, the cold having confined her longer than she preferred. Lena had been working with her for 20 minutes, talking in the low, consistent German that the horse had come to accept as the sound of safety. Rourke leaned against the stall door. "She's better with you than with anyone," he observed. "She trusts slowly," Lena said. "But when she does, it is completely." He was quiet for a moment. "When the war ends," he said, "you'll have a choice. Return to Germany or apply to remain here as a sponsored worker. The War Department has precedent for it. It requires paperwork, approval, a sponsor willing to vouch for the person." He paused. "In the days after the blizzard, I wrote to the War Department. I told them that certain women in this contingent had demonstrated the character and capability to be valuable members of this community, and that I was prepared to sponsor any of them who chose to apply." Lena looked at him. "I didn't want to wait until the end, and then find out there wasn't enough time to do the paperwork properly," he said. She thought about the night of the assembly, about the photographs, about what she had been carrying since then, and what she had been doing with it. The way she had gotten up each morning and gone to the barn and done the work. "I will need to think," she said, "and to speak with the others." "Of course," he said. "I just wanted you to know the option existed." He touched his hat brim and left. Lena stood with her hand on Flint's neck for a long time, feeling the mare's warmth and the slow movement of her breathing, and thought about Munich, about what it meant to go back to a place that had been altered past recognition, to stand in the ruins of a version of yourself that the evidence suggested could not simply be reassembled from its components, about what it might mean to stay. May 8, 1945. The news arrived in the early afternoon, carried on the radio that Lieutenant Hale kept in her office and had taken to leaving at higher volume in the final weeks of April, as the reports from Europe became both more frequent and more decisive. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In Cedar Springs, church bells began. The sound carried across the ranch on the spring wind. Distant, clear, unmistakable in its intent. Lieutenant Hale assembled everyone in the dining hall. "Germany has surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe is over." She paused for Kessler's translation. "For you, this means your status will change. You will no longer be classified as prisoners of war. Processing for repatriation will begin within the month. You will be going home." The words arrived in the room and found, among the women who received them, 43 different responses that had almost nothing in common with each other. Because home was a word that had been under enormous pressure for a very long time, and what it designated was different for each of the people being told they were going back to it. 21 women chose to stay. 22 chose to return to Germany. There was no pattern to the choosing, no common thread of age or background or circumstance. Each woman had to weigh her own particular constellation of losses and hopes, and each arrived at her answer alone. Marta came to Lena on a Wednesday evening. She sat on her cot with the photograph in her hands. Her family.
Dresden, 1941.
She had been carrying it since Cherbourg. "I am going home," she said. Lena nodded. She had known this was coming. Not because Marta had said so, but because of the specific quality of Marta's homesickness. The way it was directed. The way it had a person at its center rather than a place. "She may not be alive," Marta said. Not a statement of despair. The statement of someone who has made their calculation with the actual numbers, who is going in full knowledge of what the uncertainty contains, and is going anyway. "But if she is, she will be looking for me. I cannot let her look and not come." "No," Lena said. "You cannot." Marta looked down at the photograph for a moment. Then she held it out. "Take it," she said. "Keep it." "Marta, I need to know that someone here remembers we existed, that we were here." She pressed the photograph into Lena's hands. "Keep it for me, until I find you again." Lena held the photograph and did not speak. She put it in the inner pocket of her field jacket, against her chest. "I will keep it," she said. Later that same evening, Lena walked to the barn. She found Rourke there, checking on a mare who was due to foal. He looked up when she came in. She stood for a moment in the barn doorway, the spring night warm behind her. "You spoke of possibility," she said. "To stay. To be sponsored." She paused. "Would you be willing to do this for me?" Rourke looked at her for a long moment. The same careful assessment he had given everything from the beginning. Not rushed. Not withheld. "Yes," he said. "I'd be honored to. You've proven yourself 10 times over. This ranch, this life, you've taken to it in a way most people never do." A pause. "I think you belong here if you want to stay." "I want to stay," she said. "I choose to stay." The words, once said, settled into the air with the solidity of something that had been true before it was spoken. She had committed herself to a future she could barely imagine, in a country that had been her enemy, beside people who had somehow become the closest thing to home she currently possessed. The morning of departure came in late June. The Texas summer was already full in its intensity. The light returning to its September character, hard and absolute. Wildflowers had come up through the spring in the pastures, purple and golden drifts that moved with the wind like something breathing. The trucks were loaded. The 22 women who were returning to Germany gathered with their belongings near the main gate. The 21 who were staying stood separately. The space between the two groups was the visible geography of a decision that had been made individually and privately but now existed as a shared and public fact. The farewells were long. Women who had arrived as strangers and become, through the specific chemistry of shared difficulty, something closer than most friendships manage in ordinary time. Holding each other in the yard, exchanging addresses on scraps of paper with the urgency of people who know the postal system will be unreliable and are writing anyway because the writing is itself important. Lena and Marta held each other for a long time. There was too much to say, which produced the particular quality of silence that too much to say often produces. Not empty but containing everything that language would have diminished by attempting to carry it. Lena felt the weight of the photograph against her chest and Marta's arms around her shoulders and the June heat on the back of her neck. When they separated, Marta's eyes were bright but her hands were still. The trembling had not returned since October. The women began moving toward the trucks. Lena watched them go. 22 women crossing the ranch yard in the full summer light, carrying their belongings toward vehicles that would take them eventually toward a country that would look nothing like the one they had left. Then she heard footsteps. Vernon Hatch walked past her toward the trucks. He was in full uniform, formally arranged. He stopped at a point where he was visible to the group loading into the vehicles. He came to attention. The complete, formal attention of a man who has decided to do a thing properly or not at all. He raised his hand in a salute. Not directed toward any officer. Not required by protocol. Not ordered by anyone. A salute directed at the women boarding the trucks. Held for a full 3 seconds, the way it is supposed to be held, before he lowered his hand and walked away without looking at anyone. Lieutenant Hale, standing 10 feet from Lena, watched him do this. She did not intervene. She did not comment. Something moved briefly across her professional face that was not professional. That was something more private and more honest. Then she walked back toward her office. Lena looked at the space where Hatch had been standing. She thought about the morning in the dining hall, the tray on the floor, the 2 seconds in the blizzard, the nursing insignia. She thought about what Rourke had said on the cold January morning. What you choose to do going forward. The trucks began to move. Dust rose from the road in the familiar red-brown columns. She watched it rise and drift and thin against the blue Texas sky until the trucks had passed the rise in the road and were gone. She stood in the yard for a while longer. Then she turned and went back to the barn, where Flint was waiting, and began the morning's work. What happened to the people in this story is a matter of record, if you know where to look. Ida Krantz completed her American nursing certification in 1947 through a program at the county hospital. The head of the emergency department, who had initially doubted whether a German-trained nursing assistant skills would transfer to an American context, revised his assessment within the first month. She became head nurse of the emergency ward at Crockett County Hospital in 1953, a position she held for 24 years. She was known for 2 things: absolute composure under pressure, and a particular gentleness with children that her colleagues found surprising in someone so constitutionally efficient. Caleb Rourke spent the rest of his life on the land his grandfather had homesteaded. 25 years after victory in Europe Day, Lena Schreiber Rourke stood before a gathering at the Cedar Springs Community Center. She was 48 years old. Her hair had gone partially gray and she wore it simply. She had the bearing of someone who has been doing physical work for decades and whose body has recorded this honestly. The room was full. In the 4th row, Caleb Rourke sat with their 2 children. Both adults now, both more fluent in cattle ranching than in the language of their mother's country of origin, which was as it should be. Walt Garrison was in the 7th row, older and thinner, the pale eyes still carrying their quality of patience. Jessie Aldridge sat beside him. And in the last row, by the door because she had arrived late because the flight from Frankfurt had been delayed, sat a woman with white hair and a coat that was too warm for Texas in May, who was looking at the front of the room with an expression that contained approximately everything. Marta Vogel. She had found her mother alive in Dresden. Her brother had not returned from the war. She had rebuilt her life in the East, behind a border that made travel complicated and correspondence slow but had not, over 40 years and 847 letters, managed to interrupt it entirely. This was her first time on American soil. She had not told Lena she was coming. Lena was in the middle of a sentence when she saw her. She stopped. The room felt the stop. The particular quality of a pause that is not a pause for thought but a pause because something has arrived that requires a moment of recognition before anything else can proceed. Lena looked at Marta across the full length of the room. 25 years since the morning in the ranch yard. 25 years of letters crossing the Atlantic in both directions, carrying the ongoing record of 2 lives being lived in opposite circumstances towards something that had not yet been named. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket. The photograph was there, smaller than memory suggested, slightly more worn than it had been in June of 1945, the corner crease deepened by decades of careful handling. Marta's family.
Dresden, 1941.
She held it up. The room did not know what they were looking at, but the room understood, from the quality of the moment, that they were looking at something that mattered enormously. This photograph, Lena said, was given to me 25 years ago by a woman who needed to know that someone would remember she had been here. She paused. The woman who gave it to me is in this room. She is in the last row. She came from Germany this week for the first time in her life. Another pause. She gave me this because she trusted me to keep it. And I want her to know, I kept it. I kept everything. She set the photograph on the podium and opened the leather journal. People ask me why I stayed, she said. They want a simple answer. The truth is more complicated than any simple answer can carry. She looked at the pages, then looked up at the room. I stayed because I had seen what my country had done, and I could not reconcile that horror with returning to a place where I might spend my life in the vicinity of its justifications. I stayed because in an American prisoner of war camp in West Texas, I discovered something I had not known existed. The possibility of being held accountable and offered dignity at the same time. Not forgiven, not excused, but seen. She looked at Caleb. The men who worked this ranch had a quality that I did not have a word for in either of my languages for a long time. I have since decided the closest word is steadiness. They showed up every morning and did what the morning required, not because someone was watching, not because they would be credited for it, but because the work was there and they were capable of doing it. They treated us, enemy nationals, prisoners, women who had served the regime responsible for what those photographs showed, with a consistency of basic human recognition that I have spent 25 years trying to understand and emulate. The daily decision to see the person in front of you as a person, regardless of what the larger categories suggest you are supposed to see. She closed the journal. We cannot change where we came from, she said. We cannot undo what was done in our name, whether we knew it was being done or not. We cannot reclaim the versions of ourselves that existed before we knew what we eventually learned. She looked at the room, all of it, from the front row to the last, where Marta sat with her coat still on and her eyes very bright. But we can choose what we do from the moment we know. That choice, made every day, expressed through action rather than declaration, is the only freedom I have found to be consistently available regardless of circumstance. She picked up the photograph from the podium. She walked the length of the room. The room was very quiet. She sat down in the empty seat beside Marta Vogel and held out the photograph. Marta looked at it for a long moment. Her parents, her brother, Dresden in the summer of 1941. Then she took it with both hands and held it against her chest, and Lena put her arm around her. And the two of them sat like that while the room around them gradually found its way back to the ordinary sounds and movements of people in a shared space. Outside, the Texas summer was doing what it always did, filling the available volume of sky and land with heat and light, the horizon going on in every direction with the particular implacability of a landscape that has been making its argument for 10,000 years and does not require an audience to continue. The cottonwood trees moved in whatever wind was available. The horses in the corrals stood in the shade of the barn, their tails moving in the slow, patient way of animals for whom the afternoon is simply the afternoon. Not a symbol, not an occasion, just the specific stretch of time that follows the morning and precedes the evening, to be inhabited with the completeness they bring to every available hour. And in the Cedar Springs Community Center, In the last row by the door, two women sat together with a photograph between them. 25 years of letters. 8,000 miles of distance. One June morning in 1945 and everything that had led to it and everything that had followed from it. All of it present in the room. All of it real. All of it constituting, in its aggregate, the irreducible evidence of what people are capable of choosing, when they choose. Lena had said it the only way it could be said. Not in a single moment of decision but in the 10,000 small decisions that follow the first one, made every morning, in the direction of the life you are trying to become. 26 years in Texas. And she had never once looked at a sunset over those western hills without hearing Caleb's voice from a November evening beside a fire. Never gets old. No, it did not. It was enough. It was, in fact, everything.